Those Greeks, right? Didn't they come up with a cure for hiccups?
They'd say, listen, give me 5,000 shekels and I'll cure your hiccups. And of course, the guy's desperate. He's been having hiccups for 4 days. They'd put him in a barge with a bunch of avocados and set him adrift. And they swore that that would help. He survived by eating avocados.
Hiccups, usually they go away on their own.
And also, when he was way out at sea, of course, a big shark would come and it terrified him, and then he lost the hiccups. So it was kind of like not really a ripoff, because it did do the job. Some people never found their way back to shore, and then there would be complaints. Well, you sent my husband out there with hiccups, and now he's gone. And then he would just say, well, does he still have hiccups?
That was one way to get rid of hiccups in those days, was just to kill the guy.
Yeah, that was the budget version.
Right.
That you had to sign an exclusion clause for that before you signed up.
What was the clause?
It says, if you can't pay, I'm going to kill you.
What did they call the thing they used to interpret the Viking text?
Well, it was written with fish scales all stuck with some sort of honey paste onto the side of deer hide. And they had to decipher all these little fish scales that were placed in a code of some sort. And they did finally figure it out.
Once I got some words, it was easy to decipher.
Once they started deciphering it, then everything ran amok because, well, they started reading aloud the poetry, and it caused insanity.
Nowadays, that poetry is under lock and key. You need a team of scientists wearing Havlat suits.
Each person can only read one word, and the next person can't hear the next word. They use that computer Big Blue. So they said, if human beings can't hear it, maybe a computer can hear it, and the computer can listen to it and tell us what it thinks.
Computer just started smoking, and the whole eastern seaboard electrical system was kaput.
It was ridiculous that they actually had it hooked up to the electrical system.
This was so bad.
And this computer simply just went haywire. It scrambled its code, and they had to replace Big Blue. It was one of the first computers ever to get severely depressed.
Well, it started seeing a psychiatrist.
They gave up because the psychiatrist couldn't listen to what the computer was recounting. Then Big Blue felt that it was being ridiculed for not appreciating Viking poetry. And then it even thought there was something wrong with it for not liking Viking poetry. Well, and that caused a big problem, because then Big Blue started trying to recount the Viking poetry and like it, and trying to force himself to like it. You should see his house. I went there one time. He lives in a 2-bedroom apartment, and he's only got enough room to live in the bathroom. All everything else, the room is all full of high-tech equipment.
He was related to Cheesehead bronchitis, wasn't he?
Oh, Cheesehead. He had to sue that guy because that guy was trying to steal his brand name.
What happened to that guy?
Head Cheese had him investigated by the CIA, and he was discovered to be patently useless.
So the CIA concluded that Cheesehead bronchitis was patently useless.
No, it was the guy who was trying to imitate Head Cheese. So that was Cheesehead?
Head Cheese bronchitis is your guy, and Cheesehead bronchitis is the
imitator. He had a long string of identity theft.
That wasn't the only person that he tried to
No, that's all he ever did, was he tried to always imitate people.
Didn't he try to imitate Evel Knievel?
Oh, yeah, the Knievel-Evil syndrome. He went to Caesar's palace and said, I'll reenact the motorcycle leap, where Knievel went and broke all his bones and everything. And they said, well, that sounds great. Go ahead. Everything he did was useless. It wasn't even impressive in any manner. And so, yeah, the CIA, they arrested him and sent him to Russia to imitate Putin, see if they could confuse the Russian public. He made it right up to the Kremlin. People mistook him for the real McCoy, but he was always wearing pajamas. That was his giveaway. Yeah, that was the budget version.
Right.
That you had to sign an exclusion clause for that before you signed up.
What was the clause?
It says, if you can't pay, I'm going to kill you.
Who invented warranty?
Peter's Papaya. It was called the Pee Pee Warrantee. Buy this mule cart and you get a Pee Pee Warrantee with it. Unfortunately, it wasn't a very good warranty, because when someone came back with a cart that they bought from him and the wheel fell off, say, or the axle failed, and they'd say, well, I want my warranty. And he said, yeah, but did you put bear grease on the axle? And they didn't have bears there. They said, what the hell's a bear? Well, if you didn't do that, then the warranty was void.
Greeks invented exclusion clauses.
Yeah, so, it was, of course, people got pretty annoyed. Pee Pee, he got thrown into a volcano.
He never made it out, eh? Or did he make it out?
I think they sold him one of his grappling hooks, and they said, here's the warranty on it, Pee Pee. We're going to throw you down in the volcano with one of your grappling hooks. And he said, wait a minute, but there's no rope with this. And they said, oh, really?
What were some of the products that, didn't come with the accessories, but the accessories were pretty important?
Yes, well, there was the chariot that didn't come with a horse.
And the advertisements were a chariot with a horse being pulled, and they'd have a guy with big muscles, and you'd think, wow, if I buy this chariot, I'll have big muscles too. And then you buy it, and it's just basically a few pieces of wood.
Yeah, and then if you read the exclusion clause, it said that you have to pull the chariot yourself. But you could only see the product on display from 500 yards.
You'd say, I want to go up closer so I can get a closer look at that product. And he would say, well, you have to buy it first.
By the time you get there, it'll be ready to go. Then Big Blue felt that it was being ridiculed for not appreciating Viking poetry. And then it even thought there was something wrong with it for not liking Viking poetry. Well, then that caused a big problem, because then Big Blue started trying to recount the Viking poetry and like it, and trying to force himself to like it.
Some of the Vikings went east instead of west, like Salivation Juniper.
Oh, yeah, Salivation Juniper. She had this great fish head pastry that she thought everyone would appreciate, and she went out to distribute it to the poor. She also encountered these monks, and they were so enamored by her beauty that they all started salivating. And she fed them fish cakes. And then they started getting a little too rowdy because they were desiring her so much. So then she immediately whipped out a book of Viking poetry and just decimated them. These legends get exaggerated, but one guy escaped with half his sanity. And he said that his friends, when they were charging toward her, she would just recite a line of poetry and the person's head would explode.
The thing was, she didn't understand the language, so her head was safe.
Vikings were immune to their own bad poetry.
They had developed an immunity in the Middle Ages. Yeah, it's on their DNA.
Scientists have looked at the DNA, and sure enough, there's this unknown DNA code right there on the genes. And they did some gene therapy on this poor victim one time, and it kind of backfired. And the individual just started ranting poetry on his own, just improvising it. And it was all so terrible that it killed all the scientists in the lab. And then they had to put him out in a deserted island out in the Pacific. And he's still out there ranting away and no one can hear him.
Even if you just hear one or two words, that's it.
Oh, yeah. One time there was a person, he heard a suffix. He ended up limping for 4 months. If they just wanted to beat someone up, the Vikings, they would just throw about 6 prepositions at them. And God forbid if you got some Viking pissed off enough to start shouting bad poetry verbs at you.
Even a piece of punctuation at the wrong time could send you into a tailspin.
And the participles.
Can you give me an example of a participle in English?
Isn't it like it?
I think that's an article.
Oh, yeah, okay. It was articles. Sorry. Well, the articles could be quite vicious when you get one of those lobbed at you by an angry invader. And then the Vikings, of course, would immediately send out their best poets to attack the enemy. The drawings that have been preserved, they showed the figures, and they're standing about 10 feet away from each other, shouting participles and articles and conjunctions.
I'm not even sure what a conjunction is. Is that a word like and?
Yeah, that's a conjunction. Well, the invaders did lose in the end. They just didn't have enough prepositions.
Now, what about the Vikings' artwork?
They had an art show once, and they invited everyone around. They sent out ships, and they captured prisoners because they said, we're bringing you back to our land because we're having an art show.
So they had the Huns and the Mongols and the Zulus?
Oh, it was a big art show. This took like 10 years to go out and get enough audience members. And they wanted audience members from all these different countries. And they brought them all back to Greenland. And then they had their art show. And they were sculptures that were carved out of rock.
They specialized in phallic symbols.
Oh, yeah, it was a bunch of erotic crap. They had the grand vagina and the noble penis.
Yeah, but the testicles were way out of proportion to the rest of the penis.
Yeah, everything was out of proportion.
For the penis, they used a 10-foot pole. And then for the testicles, they used 2 little grapes.
And this was called into question by the people who were watching it. The Huns and the Mongols, especially, they were particularly pissed off because they wanted to be back invading other people. And they said, you brought us all the way out here to show us that this is what you have. Vikings have little tiny testicles. Of course, the Vikings, they thought this was just disrespectful. And of course, they read some poetry, and all their audience members just ran into the sea. When you get a bad Viking poet pissed off, look out, because they're just going to start throwing out a subordinate clause, and it's just going to take your head off. You just don't want to live anymore after you hear some of those.
Now, what about sculptures? Didn't they have something called the stinker? Like Rodin has the thinker, famous piece of sculpture. They had the stinker. It was basically a big anus.
They had this thing about body anatomy, and it was always what they thought other people would shy away from. Bad Viking poets thought that this was the fodder for great thought. He made it right up to the Kremlin. People mistook him for the real McCoy, but he was always wearing pajamas. That was his giveaway.
Didn't Head Cheese bronchitis? Head Cheese bronchitis. Didn't he have an arch villain he was always in battle against?
Oh, yeah. That's the thing. His nemesis, like Moriarty for Sherlock Holmes, or the villain who wants to kill James Bond.
Wasn't one of the villains Dr. Maybe?
Oh, yes, Dr. Maybe. He was actually always trying to capture Head Cheese bronchitis and then kill him in some ridiculous manner, because he was a big fan of James Bond and he wanted to be the villain, and he would have things like...
Didn't he wrap him in cheese string?
Oh, yes, the thin strips of cheese. Yeah, he wrapped up Head Cheese bronchitis in strips of cheese as an allusion to his name, and then he put him in the middle of a bar mitzvah.
What about the Moyle incident? Wasn't there an incident with another thing where he was at a circumcision and he was attacked by the Moyle, the guy who does the circumcising?
Oh, yeah, that was the time he dressed him up as a great big scrotum.
Which is interesting because circumcisions aren't usually costume parties. This is a special sect, right?
Really orthodox. For the circumcision, everyone has to dress up as a scrotum, which is kind of funny because the scrotum really has nothing to do with it. I mean, it's the foreskin gets cut off. They did that for safety because they used to dress up as foreskins, but someone actually got scalped.
With hedge clippers. They reenacted it in giant form with big hedge clippers.
That's exactly what happened. Yeah, Doctor, maybe he thought he had a great idea. He put a big foreskin on top of Head Cheese's bronchitis as head. Poor Head Cheese, he was drugged by this special drug that Dr. Maybe concocted, so that he kind of became like a zombie and he didn't know where the hell he was. And when he woke up, there was this Moyle with big head clippers cutting near the top of his head. Yeah, and then if you read the exclusion clause, it said that you have to pull the chariot yourself. You could only see the product on display from 500 yards.
You'd say, I want to go up closer so I can get a closer look at that product. And he would say, well, you have to buy it first.
By the time you get there, it'll be ready to go.
I mean, it was the Egyptians who invented the complaints department.
They did. They had the big complaints pyramid. And it was a long tunnel, and then at the end of the tunnel, there was a big pit.
You'd go in, and you would fall in the pit, right?
You never come back. That was the complaints department. People just stopped complaining.
Weren't the Neanderthals the first one to come up with 50% off sales?
You'd come, and they'd say, it's 50% off. We get both halves. And then the Homo sapien get really pissed off, and so the Neanderthal would call in their mathematician. He was a guy who carried around a big bag of rocks. And then they'd say, okay, we'll show you how it works mathematically. Everyone knew the Neanderthal mathematician was a really good shot. I mean, even if you tried to run away, it'd still bean you. A big Neanderthal forearm could just toss a rock like a shot put.
Well, that was Bernie, right?
Oh, yeah, Bernie Hogstein.
Bernie
Dealing with Neanderthals was pretty tough. Usually you always left with nothing. They always had some sort of logic that entailed buy 7 and we'll let you live.
Who was it that came up with the concept? You go into a store, they'll have something which is really cheap. You go in for that reason, and they actually lose money on that. That's the lost part, but it brings you into the store. That's what a lost leader is. What isn't that, the Cro-Magnon?
Oh, the Cro-Magnon's a branch of humanity. They'd open up a shop and say, we got really cheap mammoth tails. And mammoth tails were a popular ornament, and so then you get all these Homo sapiens and Neanderthals coming in at the same time. Now you've got like about 10 Neanderthals and 16 Homo sapiens, and there's not enough mammoth tails.
That's why they went extinct.
Well, you got to understand that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, when you get them together, It's basically a big brawl. And they start fighting over 2 mammoth tails that you got. And you want them to buy all the meat. And then they turn on the Cro-Magnons because they blame them for the whole mishap. And that's how the Cro-Magnons went extinct, because they were bad salesmen.
The Neanderthals and Homo sapiens killed them?
Well, they started having a brawl. And as soon as they started throwing things, the Neanderthals are pissed off at the Homo sapiens and they can't find anything to throw. Well, they grabbed the first thing on hand, and the first thing on hand was just a Cro-Magnon person.
What about loyalty clubs? Wasn't that Peking Man?
He'd sell dried bog peat moss for fires. Come get the peat moss from me, and then I'll tattoo your arm. Once you've got 6 little squares of peat moss on your arm, you get a free square of peat moss.
The little squares of peat moss would wear off, and then they got mad.
That was a danger of his business, and they find these guys in the bog nowadays. You think, well, how did he end up there? Well, it's because people got pissed off. Had come 6 times, and then they didn't get their free square of peat moss. It's very dangerous being in sales in those days because there was no governing body.
Giant form with big heads.
That's exactly what happened. Yeah, Doctor, maybe he thought he had a great idea. He put a big foreskin on top of Head Cheese's bronchitis' head. Poor Head Cheese, he was drugged by this special drug that Dr. Maybe concocted so that he kind of became like a zombie and he didn't know where the hell he was. And when he woke up, there was this moil with big head clippers cutting near the top of his head.
But at one point, didn't Head Cheese bronchitis' nemesis, Cheesehead bronchitis, kind of come to the rescue and they made peace for a while?
Oh, yeah.
There was Head Cheese and Cheesehead.
Oh, yeah, Cheesehead. He said, look at Head Cheese. I think you're getting in a lot of trouble with Dr. Maybe. I think you need some help. Well, and then Head Cheese, well, look at Cheesehead. I think I can do this on my own. And then they got each other's names confused. They couldn't remember who was Head Cheese and who was Cheesehead.
Oh, yeah, that reminds me of the story of the time that Heisenberg got an erection, but he was uncertain if it was his.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was a tragic moment in history.
Usually if you get an erection, you're pretty sure it's yours.
I know. Well, Heisenberg, the uncertainty principle was so profound in his mind that anything could become questionable. And Dr. Maybe is kind of like that, too.
Well, yeah.
He couldn't get a direct answer out of Dr. Maybe, like, why are you chasing me? You got something against me? And he'd say, maybe.
Well, he had a sidekick called Might Be.
Yeah, it was Dr. Maybe and Might Be.
So are you going to come work to me? Might be. You going to attack me? Yeah, might be. All those guys, when they went out for dinner, they never got their orders straight.
No, they would constantly sit at the table and confuse the waiters. Would you like our specialty today? Maybe. Oh, what about a wine?
That might be good.
Well, maybe. This would go around in circles. Everyone would refuse to serve them. And then, of course, they'd get angry and start some plot of revenge. One restaurant was getting harassed by Dr. Maybe and Might Be, and they were causing their fish soup to explode, and they couldn't figure it out. But so they hired Head Cheese Bronchitis. They said, our soup suddenly started exploding, and Head Cheese figured it out right away. He knew it was Dr. Maybe and Might Be.